Hey everybody, it's Tom, and I'm coming to you from Highland Coffee House today to continue the series where we are endeavoring to grant definition to crucial terms in public discourse, which are nevertheless often only vaguely defined or granted sense. And the term we're going to pick up today is race. But before I get into it, let me just quickly provisionally apologize for the suboptimal lighting conditions. But you got to do what you got to do, and sound conditions. But race obviously figures prominently in our public conversation. And on the encouraging side of this topic is broadly acknowledged as a social construction, the outcome really of consensuses consciously or unconsciously attained through cultural and institutional framework. It's not something which really is rooted in our biology. Now, despite that consensus, unfortunately, there are still people who endeavor to ground the notion of race in our biology by nuancing what are still grossly inadequate taxonomies and of human beings. What, in my view, is lamentable about those projects is that ultimately they really reflect efforts to legitimate, in one way or another, gross maldistributions of power throughout the world. And those maldistributions of power often relate not to questions of our relative merit as human beings, but as expressions of frameworks and institutions that are fundamentally oppressive, whether those terms of oppression are of an economic or cultural nature or political nature. And in fact, this issue attends not merely to the employment of a kind of scientific or sounding vocabulary in terms of race, but the use of scientific vocabularies more broadly writ, and that they conceal political agendas by giving them the appearance of a certain objectivity, or at least a certain grounding outside of the domain which can be associated with the exercise of human will or decision. Other examples where this occurs, which are really sort of reconfigurations of the same motif we see with race, are the use of things like neurobiology to explain criminal behavior, or in discussions around the global population. Sometimes coded vocabulary is employed, a quasi-scientific vocabulary is employed to justify what are really eugenic schemas, where you are seeing a gross disfavor to the, if you like, darker peoples of the world in Africa, India, and so forth. And I just want to make that point initially because I'm going to go into it at greater length when we talk about the other term, science. But to return to the notion of race, what is race? It's an effort to posit a certain segment or certain segments of the human population as having a determinate difference from other segments. A difference which almost suggests that they do not participate fully in the category of the human. And an alternative, and albeit controversial, approach to this issue is encountered through someone like Franz Fanon, whose probably most well-known book is in English, The Wretched of the Earth. He also wrote another interesting book, or relevant work, black skin, white masks, I believe is how it's often rendered. And where Fanon puts his focus is less on the exterior conditions of race, the happenstance of phenotype, or the accidents or economic statistics which attend it, but rather on the experience of race subjectively and how it plays into the formation of all our identities. Vis-a-vis, in the case of black people, what is sometimes termed the process of negrification, whereby due to the manner in which they are discussed and the vocabulary which is employed in their culture, they grow up confronted by the suggestion that they, in virtue of their blackness, are somehow inferior when set against the presumption of whiteness as the human denominator or the human default, and complementarily, people who happen to be white also are going to be affected by this conditioning, in that either they don't have to deal with the stigma of, in the formation of their identity, this threatened inferiorization, if you like. Minimally, that's a benefit. And then also, unfortunately, it can implant in them a sense of superiority. Now, that's problematic. On both sides of the equation, then, though, you see in the process of that identity formation, departure from a commitment to end a relationship with what I would say the truth of human equality. And this whole trajectory is intimately associated with, in Fanon's case, the phenomenon of colonialization, or colonization, where the colonizing force is settling people. In his case, it was the French, but it could have been the English or the Spanish or the American, depending on the particular historical situation in which you are embedded, affect their dominance of an indigenous territory, not simply through the use of force, but also through the imposition of cultural and linguistic forms that are going to somehow seed and colonize the minds and the souls of the dominated people themselves. In virtue of this, what I would say, insightful rendering of what was going on, Fanon was able to aver an alternative possibility whereby the resistance to this process could be construed as a token of the fundamental humanity of the people involved in their efforts at emancipation. And as a result of his accounts, Fanon was very influential, for example, with later people. And you can hear directly or indirectly, I don't know how closely Paulo Freire read Fanon, but you can definitely hear echoes of Fanon and Paulo Freire's work. Pedagogy of the Oppressed, a fantastic little book. If you haven't read it, I'd recommend it to you. The controversy which attends Fanon has less to do with what I've said so far, more to do with the fact that he took up the issue of violence and suggested that the process of decolonization itself was intrinsically violent. This, to me, is a debatable point, turning in part upon what you mean by the word violence. But we have to resist a kind of superficial reading of this analysis as an exhortation to just murderous behavior. Rather, when you look at the text, what you really are finding is, the text in question is, for the most crucial text that we should look, if you're just talking about Fanon, is On the Wretched of the Earth, in particular his first chapter, which is entitled Concerning Violence. And what has been offered is not so much, again, a kind of exhortation to violence, a call to arms on his part, in a gross or malignant sense, as the identification of the circumstance that colonization itself is a violent process, that the colonized have been placed in their position as subjugated or oppressed by dint of physical and psychic force applied in often grotesque and calculated manners to create this torturous, tragic situation that really is an affront to the humanity of all involved. And so to extricate oneself from that scenario is actually to necessarily draw a line, a point where you're going to say no more. Now, from here, my understanding is that Fanon and many other people think that it's very difficult pragmatically to evade the specter of employing violence of one's own to reverse the scenario. I believe a third term is in fact possible, that there are non-violent, and that's a means to effect liberation. In fact, these means are ultimately preferable because they don't rely as explicitly on a logic of coercion. They also can avoid the very real danger when one uses violence as a means of resistance, of simply replicating the original situation of oppression and a maldistribution of power without simply like resituating who the actors are. The fundamental humanity is still lost. Okay, so this all does relate back to the term of what is race, and I guess the answer, which I'm positing, is that race is a fictional category used to rationalize the treatment of some human beings as less than human beings, and is a way of masking or confronting elements in our society and in many societies which grotesquely are beneath our fundamental freedom as subjects and our capacity to live together in a spirit of, friendship and familiality, fraternity, sorority, to use the old French terms, ironically enough. And as such, is something I think that if it should either be eschewed outrightly or used very tentatively. The counterpoint is that you can provisionally use a form of identity. You can formulate your identity under a vaguely racial motif as a predicate of your resistance. And so one can really embrace one's identity as a member, this is the counterpoint, right? One can, really say that one's blackness is something to be celebrated and forwarded as a point that can be used to resist the insult of a racially oppressive order. And I can see what's happening there, though I have to register a certain concern. In fact, I already have effectively registered that concern, in that this logic potentially leads to a break or discontinuity in how we conceive of the human itself. if we're all going to be together as human beings, how is it that we're going to navigate this question of difference? And we have to be careful not to do that in a manner which can ultimately compromise an embracing project where we can all really live together. So much by way of an initial effort to deal with this issue of race. I thought I might also deal with the issue of ethnicity, but the matter has proved sufficiently complex that I'm going to sort of bracket ethnicity, at least for the moment, except perhaps to provisionally say that there's a very similar process going on with ethnicity, where you have a social framework which is used to help us define who we are. The major difference seems to be that there's a larger degree of personal volition involved in terms of whether one wants to participate in one's ethnicity as opposed to whether one wants to participate in one's race. Because the latter, the category of race, is associated with some very obvious physical characteristics of a person that makes it difficult for them to evade being treated and thus conditioned as a participant in that category. Whereas with something like ethnicity, the signposts of ethnicity are often subtle and have to do more with particular practices or happenstances of linguistic idiosyncrasy, and as such can be evaded more, not easily, but certainly more easily than in the case of race. The notion of ethnicity is emerging as a greater moment of late, probably because of the various immigration crises which are burgeoning in the world today. And there it's more issues of ethnicity and creed than overtly race, which seem to be the real pith of the matter. Quite lamentably, in my view. But the structure in terms of what's happening there is at least analogous or very similar. Now how does this relate to what we were talking about in our other videos? So far, we've talked about capitalism, socialism, and class. And I'd like to, what I would say is that the fundamental inequity can be described along largely class lines, but that class differentiation, that process often will deploy appeals to categories of racial or ethnic divide, both to justify itself and to conceal itself, and oftentimes to stir unfortunate antagonisms among the oppressed or disenfranchised themselves. Very noted example of that is the relationship between the Irish and the black in late 19th and early 20th century America, minimally, where you have two populations, the Irish, an ethnic group, and blacks, who were both being horrifyingly exploited by the framework of the society in which they were ensconced. And the roots of that exploitation in both cases could be tied to a class problem. But by emphasizing the terms upon which these people were oppressed, namely that they were Irish and that they were black, it was possible to foster the impression that they should be at odds with each other as opposed to in solidarity. And I think it's really key to appreciate what's going on there. When I say that, I should append that I am not trying to insinuate that the role played by race or ethnicity in the unfolding space of our culture and society is somehow just a fiction or a myth. It's very real in that it has very real consequences. But we should take due encouragement from the fact that these are largely manufactured categories, and as such amenable to reformulation, both for whatever they stand and the reformulation of our relationship with those categories, so that we can move beyond any fashion in which they compromise our ability to lead fully loving and embracing lives. So I'm going to leave it there. We're at just past 21 minutes, and it's funny, I was afraid I wasn't going to have enough to say it here. It's actually been the longest video so far. So this has been Tom, coming to you from Highland, a coffee house here in Cincinnati, Ohio. Apologize again for the suboptimal conditions. And we've been talking about race and a little bit about ethnicity. Next topic I think we will take up is gender. So we will have that in the next video. So anyway, guys, thanks so much for listening, and I'll catch you guys tomorrow.